I shall start. All right. Thank you very much for coming. This is a keynote address, last one. I am very, very glad to be able to have Claudio Lomnitz with us today. Professor Claudio Lomnitz is the Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University, and formerly he was Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the Committee on Historical Studies at the New School University. He was also co-director of the University of Chicago's Mexican Studies Program, director of the University of Chicago's Latin American Studies Program, and director of Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Born in Chile, Lomnitz received his undergraduate degree from Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Iztapalapa in Mexico, and a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University. He works on the history, politics, and the culture of Latin America, and particularly of Mexico. He is an imaginative and prolific writer, and his books include Exits from the Labyrinth, Culture and Ideology in the Mexican National Space, Modernidad Indiana, 9 ensayos sobre nación y mediación en México, Deep Mexico, Silent Mexico, An Anthropology of Nationalism, Death and Idea of Mexico, and his most recent book, which was just being published, in The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón. His first book, which was published a long time ago, at the beginning of the 80s, was Evolución de una Sociedad Rural. And I am proud that I was one of the first who read the manuscript and gave comments, but I don't know if he remembers it. I must add that he also writes in non-academic genre. He's a regular collaborator at La Jornada, a Mexican newspaper, and he also wrote a weekly column in Excelsior, another newspaper. In 2010, he was awarded Mexico's National Drama Award for a historical play titled El Verdadero Bulnes, co-authored with his brother Alberto Lomnitz. Professor Lomnitz is former editor of journal Public Culture, and today he will talk about public life and anthropology. His address will be followed by comments by Motoi Suzuki of the National Museum of Ethnology and William Beeman of University of Minnesota. I would like to invite Professor Lomnitz to the podium for his address. Please welcome Professor Lomnitz.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'd like to begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to the organizing committee of UAES for having asked me to address you today, and especially to Professor Junji Koizumi, who, as you surmised, is an old and deeply respected colleague of mine who, over the years, I've had the privilege of interacting with. It's an honor to be here. And I'm also touched and, in fact, a bit surprised by the recognition of being invited to address a plenary session like this. So thank you very much for this honor. I want to launch my remarks on the future of anthropology and the anthropologies of the future, which focus on the public life of the field of anthropology, with a brief analysis First, of my feeling of surprise at this invitation, since that sentiment, that is the sentiment of surprise, is related to my main ideas concerning anthropologies of the future and their future. I never imagined that one day I'd be asked to deliver a plenary session in an international anthropology congress. I know the honor wouldn't haunt most people, most people's fantasy lives either in particular, but in my case, the sense of surprise at the arrival of the invitation comes, I think, from my very own uncertain relationship to place, and as a result, to representation. Most often, I think, or I thought until recently, individuals who are asked to represent a national tradition, or they are at the very least founders and leaders of an institution. I cannot quite do that, despite the fact that I've written several books that have the word Mexico in the title, and although I participate actively in Mexican public life. I cannot represent Mexico for a number of reasons, but the most important is that I've taught in the United States for the past 25 years now. On the other hand, I could scarcely represent American anthropology abroad because during those 25 years, I've assumed a position of a guest and never once participated in any institutional contention over the future of the discipline, never tried to steer it this way or that, despite having taught in departments like the University of Chicago or Columbia that have established identifiable programs for the discipline over the years. I suppose that I never felt that the discipline was mine to steer. So being neither quite a Mexican nor an American anthropologist, and not being a patriarch in any of the institutions that I've worked in, I assumed that my work would always remain marginal to both Mexican and American traditions, say nothing of what anthropologists from other lands might think about me or see in my work. Now, I've recently explored the root of this sensation of marginality, a false sensation in my case, I now realize, in my most recent book, The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, for which I ask you, since I have the privilege of the podium, to send good vibrations because it's just come out and it needs all of the good karma of this group. And that book is an anthropological history of the first grassroots transnational movement on the US-Mexican borderlands, mobilized by a radical circle of anarchists and socialists around the buildup of the Mexican Revolution, to the Mexican Revolution of 1910. In that work, I discuss the strange relationship between major and minor figures that exists in Mexican-US transnationalism, a relationship characterized by constant movement for the Mexican exiles between occupying major dominant registers in Mexico and minor registers in the United States. I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment, but I wish to say at this point that in my view, movement between major to minor positions or registers is a key to understanding the anthropologies of the future. I'll begin with a little comment on major and minor registers in the US-Mexico border and move from there to my own history and into anthropologies of the future. National differences are productive on international borders. This is practically an axiom of border studies. If the price of gasoline is cheaper on one side of the border than on the other, this produces border traffic. If the price of labor varies, that produces border traffic. If law enforcement is stronger on one side than the other, that produces border traffic. In short, national differences become economically, politically, or symbolically productive on and across international borders. The fact that the US-Mexican border has the most traffic of any international border in the world suggests, then, that differences between Mexico and the United States run deep indeed, and that these differences are deeply productive. US-Mexican transnationalism got started in earnest in the 1880s when the two countries were first connected by rail and when the so-called Apache Wars, which had lasted 100 years, concluded and the frontier was settled. At that point, Mexico became the object of a huge influx of American capital. By 1910, more than 60% of all US foreign investment was in Mexico. Thus, we may say that Mexico became the biggest source of migrant labor for the United States only after it had been the single largest foreign destination for American capital. As a result, Mexico's politicized migrants of the early 20th century, the people who I studied in my most recent book, starting with its revolutionary exiles, had much to learn from American politics, since American interests were part and parcel of Mexican affairs. Meanwhile, American radicals of the period too came to understand the underbelly of their own government and the shenanigans of their corporations by seeing how they operated in Mexico. However, even the experiences of educated Mexican exiles and their educated American comrades were not symmetric, because the relationship between Mexico and the United States was not equal. Indeed, border transvaluation, what I've called elsewhere the magic threshold of the border, which is something that occurs in movement of people through the border, worked differently for Mexicans and Americans. Americans who crossed into Mexico tended, by the mere fact of crossing, to become members of a kind of aristocracy. Specialized American workers living in Mexican cities and towns lived in American enclaves for the most part, and they belonged to clubs, played mahjong, and etc. Thus, specialized rail worker Gordon Campbell White, I'm talking here, by the way, all very early 20th century, late 19th century here. Thus, specialized rail worker Gordon Campbell White scribbled in his diary, quote, "I'm inclined to classify the Mexicans as follows: bastards, 70%, syphilitics, 80%, thieves and whores, 90%, pure Indians, 85%, brainless, 95%, 1,000 years distant from real civilization, 97%, and God help the other 3%. He's pretty witty, this. Indeed, as historian Jonathan Brown has shown, the worst racism of Americans against Mexicans in Mexico at that time was of skilled laborers like Gordon Campbell White. They'd become a genuine labor aristocracy in Mexico and were deeply invested in preserving those privileges by keeping Mexicans untrained and banning their access to unions. Transvaluations for Mexicans tended in the opposite direction. It was, as I've shown in other work, in the United States that the term Mexican became a racial term. Migrants into the United States tended, or were at least vulnerable to entering a racial slot as Mexicans, regardless of their origin. And there are plenty of cases around the time of the Revolution of educated Mexicans occupying manual labor positions in the United States. General Felipe Angeles, for instance, waited tables in New York, and journalist and accountant Enrique Flores Magón worked as a laborer in the fields of Southern California. These are both major figures in Mexican political life. Both of these were very talented men. Given these dynamics of border transvaluation, a number of the Mexican Revolution's key ideologues were at once major and minor figures. Indeed, movement across the US-Mexican border routinely transformed protagonists of Mexican public life into minor figures. I don't mean to say that border crossing diminished these men and women's worth, but rather that it shifted their subject position from one who identifies with the language of national prestige, what I call a major register here, or a major subject position, to that of an easily disregarded member of a minority. As intellectuals, the anarchists and socialist exiles of my study went from being readers of and writers for major Mexican papers and other venues to devotees of the arts that philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari identified as the literary practices of the, quote, minor, characterized by political immediacy, linguistic displacement, and heavy reliance on bricolage. This movement from major to minor is, I think, relevant for thinking about the anthropologies of the future. My reason for believing this is twofold. First, globalization is making for movement between different and unequal anthropologies, including movement between so-called Southern anthropologies that also have differences and inequalities between them, but second, because the conditions for developing anthropology generally have become at once more widely accessible and more precarious. The movement of anthropologists between traditions, mine could be a case in point, allows for and at times demands new movements between major and minor registers, movements that have distinct dangers and distinct creative possibilities, though I'll emphasize the latter here. But perhaps even more important than this movement of anthropologists between national and institutional traditions is the second factor, increased accessibility of anthropological knowledge combined with the growing precariousness of conditions for doing anthropology. There's more access, due mostly to the revolution in communications and computational technologies. The web and digitalization have signified a genuine revolution in access to knowledge. There's no question about that. The contents of libraries and archives can now be accessed from any part of the world. Not all of them, I don't want to exaggerate, but there's a lot of access. Not freely, perhaps, not to everyone, certainly, but there is a revolution of access. That is a fact. On the other hand, we see increased precariousness of conditions for sustained and specialized anthropological inquiry. The employment situation for students has shifted so dramatically that the Weberian idea of a profession is becoming increasingly difficult for youth to embrace, that is, or a calling, as the Weber. That precariousness of employment means that anthropological knowledge is becoming increasingly hybridized with other practices. Activist anthropologists, journalist anthropologists, advertiser anthropologists, diplomat anthropologists, etc. Or even more commonly, people who are not themselves anthropologists and who would not attach the term anthropologist to their identity, but who cultivate anthropological interests in a quite serious way. Border transvaluation is, in this context, one example of the kind of shift from major to minor register that will increasingly characterize anthropological practice. And this, I argue, affects both formal experimentation and the content of the knowledge we produce. Allow me to return to the Mexican border revolutionaries of my book before focusing squarely on the implications of this movement between major and minor registers for contemporary anthropology. When he was asked for advice and criticism of a piece of poetry, Mexican anarchist and revolutionary Ricardo Flores Magón, a man who had, quote, ink as his passion from his teenage years on, wrote back sincerely, quote, "You want me to be a critic, my good comrade, and I think it sensible to decline such a function. I cannot judge your productions for one simple reason, to wit, that I've forgotten all about rhetorical rules." Ricardo was not lying when he said that he had forgotten the rules of rhetoric. At one time, back in Mexico, he thought he knew them so well that he had taken it upon himself to train his kid brother, Enrique Flores Magón, on their use. But after years of living, printing, and struggling in the United States, Ricardo no longer had the stomach for pontificating on that subject. His minority position in the United States, surrounded by speakers of other languages and in constant exchange with clumsy readers and writers of Spanish and English, had taught him a different kind of writing, a writing that was at once more precarious and more vital. All of Mexico's principal revolutionary leaders avoided residence in the United States insofar as they could. They knew very well what living in the United States might do to them and tried to keep a gingerly distance from a country that would transform them into minorities, quaint or vile Mexicans, Wild West Road show attractions, singers in bars, assistants to a local consul, ghostly personages in segregated Mexican sections of town. Indeed, when Mexican public figures went into exile, they became like shadows, existing only in Spanish-language newspapers and rarely meriting even a passing reference in the egregious pages of America's mainstream press. I suppose that I never imagined that I'd be asked to consider the future of anthropology publicly because my constant movement between Mexico and the United States has heightened my ability to represent Mexico, including Mexico in the United States and the United States in Mexico, but it has diminished my ability to be representative. I must write and speak in English and Spanish too well, but also too incorrectly, and switch too often between them to be representative. Occupy minor and major registers too often to retain fixity, centrality, and visibility. And yet, I now believe that attention to transitions between major and minor registers provides a key to the future of anthropology, as well as to the anthropologies of the future. So the next part of the paper is about shifting terrains of major and minor in Latin American anthropology. And it starts with a section called Caballos de Santo. Darcy Ribeiro once said that Brazilian anthropologists were, quote, caballos de santo. A caballo de santo is a person who's possessed by a saint in macumba or candomblé rituals. What Darcy meant by this witty remark was that Brazilian anthropologists were possessed by, incorporated, and stood for the spirits of great foreign anthropologists. And I think great foreign anthropologists has to be capitalized, great foreign anthropologists. Who were meant to be the source of every idea and of every truly autonomous decision and movement. One Brazilian anthropologist might be possessed by Claude Lévi-Strauss, another by Max Gluckman, a third by Leslie White, etc. Darcy's idea already implied at least some recognition of the fertility of the movement between major and minor traditions in anthropology, with anthropologists from peripheral or semi-peripheral nations like Brazil or Mexico standing as points of contact and brokerage between local audiences and the prestige of the great traditions. Certainly, I remember my own sense of emotion, my sense of contact with the sacred, when I first traveled to places that were sources of this kind of anthropological authority. I remember, for instance, my walks across the Berkeley and the Stanford campuses when I was a graduate student, touching walls that had been touched by Alfred Kroeber, breathing the air that Robert Lowy or Clifford Geertz breathed. Even at Stanford, which was a relative parvenu in terms of anthropological aura, I was awed by the feeling that my teachers, Joe Greenberg, for instance, or G. William Skinner, had themselves been students or close friends of people like Edward Sapir or Victor Turner. And now I was studying with them, and I could take that back with me to Mexico. This sentiment of proximity to the sacred was only magnified during my year of study in Paris, where anthropological lineages run much deeper. Taking courses at the École Normale Supérieure at the Rue d'Ulm and touching bronze casts of former students or professors there, people like John Calvin, Rousseau or Diderot, or much closer to home, Marcel Mauss, Émile Durkheim, or Claude Lévi-Strauss. The sentiment of proximity to the sacred was so strong that it affected what was to be my only personal encounter with Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was to me a most admired figure. I sat in on Claude Lévi-Strauss's weekly talks at the Collège de France in the year 1981-82. It is true that I understood only a little of what he said, but nonetheless I was there, sitting somewhere near the back, not far from the old ladies who came to knit near the heaters. Indeed, I found my place in a kind of buffer zone between the initiates. This is at the Collège de France, where there are public lectures, so that there are a lot of old elderly ladies who go knit there because it has heating. So I found my place in a kind of buffer zone between the initiates, the people who really understood what Lévi-Strauss was saying, which were right around near him, and the old ladies who were there for the heat. I was, in the intermediate zone. Well, one day, Maurice Godelier, who was my advisor that year, invited his students to the Musée de l'Homme for a screening of his new film on New Guinea. I went, of course. At that time, I studied often in the library of the Musée de l'Homme, a place that had a strong personal significance for me because my grandfather, Miguel or Misha Adler, had studied with Paul Rivet there in the early 1930s as a result of the influence of his friend, the Peruvian Marxist José Carlos Mariátegui. So there I was at the cocktail preceding the Godelier screening, and lo and behold, there was Claude Lévi-Strauss in the flesh, standing right in front of me. And Lévi-Strauss was alone with no entourage. So I thought to myself, here's your chance. Go up to him, speak to him. But what should I say? I thought about that for a moment and could come up only with banalities such as, I admire your books. Well, who doesn't, I thought, and decided that I had nothing of significance to say to the man. I had nothing to say, and yet I seemed to need something from this encounter, so I walked ahead and, quote, distractedly brushed past him in the hope that something of his genius might at least rub off on me. It was an act of sympathetic magic in the face of the sacred. I believe that this attitude was molded by my subject position as a Latin American anthropologist, an aspiring cavallo de santo. The next section is called Gamio, and in parentheses, and Freire. And yet the work of the anthropologist as cavallo de santo was always way more creative and much less derivative than Darcy Ribeiro's sarcastic formulation might lead us to believe. I'll dwell here on one example, but could, if I had more time to discuss, dwell on two, both of them Franz Boas students, Manuel Gamio of Mexico and Gilberto Freire of Brazil, each of them key anthropologists of the early 20th century. In my generation, and this is my generation in Mexico, Manuel Gamio was thought of as being the, quote, father of Mexican anthropology. As an anthropologist who's also an historian, that's me, I've learned to be skeptical of such kinship denominations. There were, of course, fathers and arguably even an occasional mother of Mexican anthropology long before Gamio, dating back at least to Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century, according to some. Indeed, when I was an undergraduate in Mexico City, we were compelled to take a course called Precursors of Anthropological Theory that I found irritating because of its implied teleology. I somehow found Herodotus to be more interesting than Radcliffe Brown, and Sahagún made better reading than Robert Redfield, but that's beside the point. It was at least clear from that course that there were constantly new foundations for our discipline, and that every attempt to mark a beginning and to name a father is deeply situational. Indeed, just last month, I was stunned by a report from a friend, the Italian historian Alessandro Stanziani, who's a professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and with whom I shared a year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin a couple of years ago. Alessandro had not heard of me before we met in Berlin, so when he returned to Paris, he asked an anthropologist colleague at the École whether he knew me, and his colleague responded, "Mais c'est le père de l'anthropologie mexicaine." Why, he's the father of Mexican anthropology. This is me. I don't know the name of the anthropologist who said this to Alessandro, and I have to ask him in order to send the man some flowers or perhaps a box of chocolates. Ask him to be my Valentine. I love him. Or I would do that, certainly. My vanity knows no limits, except that since my own mother is a Mexican anthropologist, the statement disturbed me a bit. Was I my mother's father? Or worse, was I a new Oedipus who had married my mother in order to become the father of Mexican anthropology? Responding with the sort of horror of incest that Freud once wrote about, I decided to forgo the patriarchal fantasies that the enthusiastic Frenchman had planted in my brain. As regards Mexican anthropology, I think it best to follow Bart Simpson and to recognize one thing openly here and now. I didn't do it. You really didn't. But I've gotten sidetracked. My point was that Gamio was important. And he was. It's true that Manuel Gamio was never the dazzling and original writer that Gilberto Freire was, or that Franz Boas was. Guillermo de la Peña studied Gamio and Boas's personal correspondence some years ago and found Boas occasionally chiding his student, asking him to concentrate less on politics and more archaeology. Get that chronology down, Boas seemed to demand of his student. Don't forget to collect all the archaeological specimens that we need. The fact that a revolution was raging in Mexico at the time seemed but an irritating distraction to Boas. I never, of course, never met Boas, of course, but I've never actually heard a recording of Boas, but I imagine a German accent when it comes to his authority for some reason. A revolution is no excuse. A revolution should not get in the way of science. I have to say, I admire Boas for that, by the way, in parentheses. And Gamio, like a second Hernán Cortés, obeyed but did not comply. Indeed, with a shrewdness reminiscent of the wily conquistador, Gamio used Boas's theories of cultural relativism for purposes of his own. Rather than rejecting racism and social Darwinism outright, doing so would have been difficult in Mexico's cultural milieu of the 19-teens, when these theories were the bedrock of all positive science, Gamio used cultural relativism to place Indian and Spanish cultures on equal footing in order to promote a racialized image of the national subject, the Mexican as mestizo. And he then used that figure to forge a key image of a national future for Mexico. Gamio's work at Teotihuacan, famous pyramids that are right outside of Mexico City, was at the same time a scientific research project and a project of revolutionary intervention and redemption. Gamio published this book in the early 1920s, 1924. The work was done from 1917 to the early 1920s. For Gamio was at once a government agent in charge of distributing land through agrarian reform and of setting up various educational and development projects, and the director of a major archaeological and ethnological project. That potent combination, which was completely distinct from the knowledge space occupied, say, by Franz Boas. To my knowledge, Franz Boas never distributed land. Led Gamio to create a powerful and quite durable chronotope for the Mexican nation. The ancient city of Teotihuacan that flourished between the year 0 and the year 900 AD had been the largest city in America and was only surpassed in size in the early decades of the 19th century by New York. For Gamio, the Great Pyramids of Teotihuacan stood as proof of Mexico's great past, and so as an image of its attainable future. The peasant village of San Juan Teotihuacan, which is right next to the pyramids, on the other hand, that is, the living population that had settled in the shadow of the Great Pyramids, was seen as the degraded and degenerated result of Spanish colonialism and of neo-colonial oppression under the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, that is, the pre-revolutionary regime. This population was to be the object of the revolutionary state's redemptive action. In Gamio's chronotope for Mexico, the pyramids stood at once for the grandeur of the past and the potentiality of the nation's future. The real live peasant inhabitants of Teotihuacan represented a present tense, still suffering from colonial degradation, while the revolutionary state, guided by its enlightened anthropologists, was the engine of transformation that would lift the degraded Indian back to the grandeur that was his birthright. This was Gamio's chronotope. Viceroys of anthropological science. And yet, despite the vast ambition and originality of Gamio's project, recall that the Mexican Revolution was the first social revolution of the 20th century, and there had been no anthropologists in this position before, either in the United States, Britain, or France, Gamio still identified as Boas's student. In part, this was simply done in fairness. Gamio owed much to Boas's ideas, as we all do to our teachers, and most especially when we've had the privilege of having great teachers. But in part, the figure of the national anthropologist as the voice of a greater foreign god was simply useful, since it deflected responsibility away from a vulnerable individual, Gamio in this case, and toward the sacred light of a universal science represented always by those unreachable, thank you so much, by those unreachable people who are truly capable of being universal, not Mexican anthropologists or Brazilian anthropologists or Nigerian anthropologists, but anthropologists teaching in the great universal schools in Paris, at Oxford, at Columbia, Berkeley, Harvard, or Chicago. The strategy is reminiscent of the powers of the viceroy in the colonial era, a man who governed freely, but with the portrait of the king at his back. Decline of the national form and of what one may call the Mexican model. Useful though it was, however, the national formula inhabited by Gamio and by others like him turned out to have its own dates of expiration. It was predicated on a form of robust national development that had not existed in the 19th century and that would again enter a stage of decline toward the end of the 20th century, a period that is often referenced as the, quote, neoliberal era. In the Mexico of the 1980s, the decline of the great national moment produced a sharp, though I think not definitive, I do think not definitive, but that's still up for grabs, decline in the role and prestige of anthropology in public debate. To a large extent, this decline was related to the radical restructuring of the Mexican state. Mexican revolutionary action with regard to the so-called redemption of the Indian had been led by an enlightened establishment of anthropologists. Now that the state was shedding development projects right and left, anthropologists had increasingly little to say about public matters. Where were they speaking from? Who were they speaking to? There was much confusion with regard to these questions. This deep sense of dislocation was poignantly performed at the National School of Anthropology, ENA, in the mid-1980s, when the school gained an innovative director, the late Alejandro Figueroa, who decided to begin his term with a cleansing ceremony, his term as director of the National School, with a cleansing ceremony for the school, complete with rock concert for the community. Alejandro invited a Yaqui Indian Maracame. Alejandro was from Sonora, the state where the Yaquis are from, and had worked with the Yaquis. A Maracame is a healer or a shaman, to come to Mexico City to help diagnose and heal the once great National School of Anthropology, a school that had been founded in 1911 by Gamio and by Franz Boas himself, and that was in obvious decline by then. We need a little ethnographic detail to comprehend the Maracame, the shaman's diagnosis for the ills of Mexican anthropology, so please bear with me for a moment. The old National School of Anthropology, where I initiated my studies, I'm proud to say, was inside the building of Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology, which was and is still a crown jewel of Mexican national achievement. But in the late 1970s, the school was moved to a new location on the edge of a freeway adjoining the site of an ancient pyramid, the Pyramid of Cuicuilco, and across the freeway from the National School is a great shopping mall that's called Perisur. And so the Yaqui Indian healer's diagnosis was this. The National School of Anthropology's Feng Shui, I'll call it that because I don't know what, but let's just call it the Feng Shui, was all wrong with regard to the pyramid at Cuicuilco, for it had been built in a position in which it received all of the pyramid's bad vibes, while all the good vibes went in the other direction across the freeway to the shopping mall at Perisur. The implication was that leaving the National Museum of Anthropology had been a bad idea. So, and the Maracame spoke truly, for the market liberalization of the 1980s was indeed the death knell of the national model of anthropological representation. Anthropology was no longer able to harness the past in order to shape new futures. This was the crisis of the 1980s. And this was also the moment of rupture of the old model of the national anthropologist as cavallo de santo, as national representative of the great tradition. Genre crossing. Neoliberalism made for new conditions of movement in anthropology. These new conditions are in some ways closer to the situation of the pre-revolutionary exiles that I studied than to those of Agamio or of Darcy Ribeiro's Brazilian colleagues. These new conditions include exciting possibilities of expansion and exchange, currently operating under the optimistic battle cry of South-South exchange. They've also made for much more cross-fertilization between various institutional traditions, increasingly common, as is obvious in our meetings here in Japan. On the other hand, while the explosion of modes of communication and of access to information and to its reproduction has radically expanded the forms of circulation, reproduction, and transformation of anthropological knowledge and ideas, the lack of professional jobs has amplified and magnified a kind of anthropological dilettantism that I believe needs to be accepted and even embraced. For the most part, of course, I would believe that because I've always been very much of a dilettante, but you asked me to give this talk, so you're stuck with it. For the most part, today's students at Mexico's National School of Anthropology will never be professional anthropologists. And yet, when I write also for them. This means engaging questions of form as much as content, forgetting, perhaps like Ricardo Flores Magón, the rules of rhetoric. The issue today is somewhat distinct from the situation that led Clifford Geertz to call for cutting across writing genres in the American Academy of the 1970s and early 80s. In that context, transgressing traditional genres was connected to several distinct factors. First, to the deep transformation of the object of anthropological inquiry, thanks to globalization and to the decline of radical cultural difference, to the emergence of new technologies, and to looming environmental and political transformations. Second, new attention to genres was supported by the everyday practice of college liberal arts curricula in the United States, which fostered the development of a kind of humanistic lingua franca, and so new syntheses of relevant canons are, occasionally required. Third, Geertz recognized the need to create new intellectual genealogies that fit the contemporary objects of research, which occasionally meant breaking out of some of the formative molds of American anthropology in order to invade or borrow from new traditions and territories, ranging from literature to history to philosophy. Finally, the fact that the anthropologies of the 1980s were focused so obsessively on emergent phenomena made reaching outside of the traditional anthropological canon a natural fact. This was, after all, the time of the rise of cultural studies, a field whose very newness made it ideally suited to the description of an overwhelming array of emergent social forms and phenomena. Cultural studies had less baggage than any established social science discipline, so it was in a good position to focus on the phenomenology of the New World historical era that was emerging alongside a technological revolution. But today, we're no longer at the time of the birth of cultural studies, when what was at stake was, on the one hand, the formation of a new canon that was to be dubbed theory with a capital T, and on the other, the tracking of emergent phenomena that made it clear that we were entering a new epoch in world history. The cultural studies moment is now past, that's in my opinion. It expired thanks to its practitioners' almost single-minded opinion on the a single-minded focus on the emergent. As in the Bob Dylan song, its very success was its failure. Today, we need equal sensitivity to emergent social forms as we do to those that are dominant and residual. Historical work is again deeply relevant and vibrant as a site of critique, as is the sociology and ethnography of dominant social forms. Moreover, cultural studies tended to be quite interested in what historian William Sewell has called, quote, eventful history, tended to be quite less interested in what historian Bill Sewell has called eventful history than in teleology, manifested in attachment to broad epochal categories of analysis such as capitalism, Fordism, globalization, or neoliberalism. Even concepts that are as heavily laden with historical innuendo as postmodernism, which, like today's hipsterism, was so fond of all kinds of historical allusions, knowing winks, ironic play, even that was flattened out in order to emphasize its break with the past rather than contemplating its relationship to it. Yet historical work is keenly relevant today, and this has led students to recover fields like history or anthropology and to recoil a bit from cultural studies. On the other hand, ethnographies, traditional ethnographies that rely on descriptive techniques and concepts that were first developed by people like Malinowski, Gluckman, Goffman, Turner, Barth, etc., can be perfectly serviceable and relevant today simply because we know so little about the microsociology of dominant institutions. This is not to say that ethnography should be traditional, by no means, but rather it is to recognize that even traditional ethnographic techniques and approaches can be very useful and pertinent today. In short, the logic behind the transgression of genres that governed the cultural studies era was different from the dynamic that I'm referring to here. The movement that I'm tracking has more to do with the differential topography of intellectual specialization and of reading publics. Bless you. It's guided, as I've said, by the political potentiality of movement between major and minor forms. This movement can occur in different ways and for different reasons. Transnationalism is one of these. Another is new forms of class movement and access to knowledge and knowledge production to people who are moving across statuses in new ways. When I was applying to graduate school in the United States, this was in the late 70s, I visited Berkeley, and I remember Laura Nader saying that she wanted anthropologists to, quote, study up. That is, to avoid focusing so single-mindedly on the poor and instead to shed light on the social world of elites. That was certainly a warranted and noble injunction, but I think that in those days it was still difficult to envision the fact that very soon many anthropologists would, quote, study up not as a grand and deliberate personal decision, but simply because they routinely came from lower places even than their quite modest subjects. So, for instance, when I returned from graduate school to Mexico City to teach in the early 1980s, I got a job at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, which was my alma mater. When I had studied there just a few years before, the student population mixed children from professional parents, more or less like myself, with students who were the first in their families to accede to a college education and who came from more modest backgrounds. When I returned to the UAM as a teacher, the school was starting to get vacated by the middle class, who were increasingly moving to private universities, although I have to say a lot of the middle class has since returned. And the student body was increasingly made up of students of modest means. The implications of this struck me in conversation with one of my colleagues, Ricardo Falomir, who had been doing a long-term study of an old factory town, Atlisco, for more than a decade. Ricardo had taken his students out to the field, which was part of the curriculum of the UAM in those days, and when he returned, he remarked that this was the first time he'd gone to the field when all of his students came from homes that were poorer than those of the working class subjects of his study. Today, it is difficult for professors to envision the trajectories of their students. As a result, many of the presuppositions that are the starting point of the teaching curriculum are simply wrong. In a context such as this, the problem of crossing genres takes on a new sense. Anthropologists today need to find ways of engaging in multiple registers because channels of reproduction, dissemination, and transformation of anthropological inquiry are both greater than ever and more deeply precarious than they were when the professional field consolidated. I would not presume to transform these observations into a collective program, but I'd like to dedicate my final remarks to reflecting a bit on my own play with genre, which has been a result of these multiple experiences of productive movement between differences and of movement between major and minor forms. I'll focus briefly on two experiences, the first as a newspaper columnist and the second as dramatic writer, and move from there to a brief conclusion. My column. I've written a regular column in Mexico City newspapers for a number of years now, almost 10 years. For a couple of years, I had a weekly column in Excelsior, which I would characterize as a mainstream liberal paper. And for the past 3 years, I've had a column every other week in La Jornada, which sees itself as the paper of the left. Neither of these columns would have been available to me in a US paper, despite the fact that I've lived in the United States for 25 years now. They would not be available because the sort of space that I occupy in Mexico is not available to me in the United States. About 10 years ago, I began to write an editorial column that appeared every Monday in Excelsior. Although this habit appeared outlandish to my colleagues in the American Academy, it's not so very unusual or heroic in Mexico, a country that has quite an appetite for opinion, almost in inverse proportion, alas, to its support of investigative journalism. In the newspapers I find in Mexico, and I read a lot of them, are really full of opinion. Indeed, the lack of a single dominant newspaper in Mexico City, there is no equivalent there to the New York Times, Le Monde, or El País, has meant that there is a relatively large number of editorialists in the mainstream press. The newspapers Reforma, La Jornada, El Universal, Milenio, Excelsior, El Financiero, or La Razón each have their stable of 4 or 5 editorialists who rotate on a daily basis in a weekly cycle. Thus, each paper has a stable of 20 or so editorialists. Multiplied by 6 or 7 papers, this makes me one of 100 or more editorial writers in the mainstream Mexico City press. I share this information in order to place my activity in the modest light in which it belongs. Still, I am a player in Mexico's Kula ring of opinion making, a system of production and circulation that's based on the practice that editorialists have of reading and taking freely of each other's work. Thus, I've observed on occasion, and always with a small sense of triumph, that a piece that I frame one day in La Jornada is picked up, though rarely acknowledged, which is an accepted rule of the game, 3 days later by a colleague in El Universal or La Razón, or better yet, by a beat reporter who follows through with further news thanks to heightened interest on the topic. I, in turn, take from the work of others with equal liberality. Already here, there's a shift of genre with regard to academic work, where receiving credit for one's ideas and work is so important. In journalism, it's popularity and influence, but only rarely direct accreditation of original work. The production of an editorial involves scouring the daily news for suitable topics and reading the work of one's fellow editorialists in order to know what it is that is currently spinning. They don't call it circulation for nothing. My particular practice involves reading 4 Mexico City papers every day, plus the New York Times and the Financial Times. That's pretty much what I do. The rest, research into specific topics, depth of available references, analysis, and expository style is supplementary, variable, and depends entirely on what I've chosen to write about. Although writing for Latin America from New York has a pedigree that reaches back to the journalistic career of the great Cuban writer and revolutionary José Martí, who was Latin America's first foreign correspondent, post-internet practice differs from its 19th century predecessor because the world media is now available via internet to any editorial writer in Mexico, while the Mexican papers are also instantly available to me, which of course they weren't to Martí. Writing from a distance is for me a way of accompanying Mexican opinion, an excuse for reading the daily papers, despite the fact that I live in New York, and it adds a voice that's inflected by a different quotidian experience and so brings a distinctive point of view to Mexican public discussion. The internet thus changes the shape of the public that may be interpolated by the newspaper, extending its reach to select sectors of the Mexican diaspora, including its diaspora of anthropologists. My expertise as an historian and as an anthropologist and my location as a professor in the American Academy are the resources that I bring to the circle of exchange that is Mexican editorial production. Today, that is amplified by the fact that I now direct a new Center for Mexican Studies at Columbia, which is a visible site of public discussion of Mexican culture and affairs. The newspaper's opinion editor is attentive to these facts, and indeed he chooses his stable of editorialists based on a variety of factors in order to guarantee that a range of perspectives is brought into the circuit. At Excelsior, when I was writing there, one editorialist was a party leader, the other a scion of prominent family, a third a consummate political analyst, another is a writer, an environmentalist, a TV personality, or a political insider. Because of this composed diversity, the newspaper was able to give each of us liberty to write about whatever comes to our minds. It was tranquil in the security that Mexico's conservative cardinal, Norberto Rivera, who wrote his editorials for Excelsior on Sundays, would say something very different from what I might have come up with on the Monday. The cocktail of editorialists at La Jornada is very different from that of Excelsior, but it is a cocktail, and the contrast between editorialists is indispensable. I would say that the voice of anthropologists is today underrepresented in opinion formation in Mexico, as compared to, say, that of historians, economists, or political scientists. I think very underrepresented, in fact. To give a sense of the topical range involved in my practice, in the last 6 months, I wrote pieces on the death of rock star Lou Reed, an anthropological reading of communitarian violence in Michoacán, an essay on the significance of cooperation versus competition for Mexico's educational reform, a critique of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro's policy toward the opposition, a piece on the emergence of new anthropologies in Mexico, an article arguing for a new Mexican cultural imperialism oriented to reaching into the United States and Central America, and an anthropological study of miracles and why we still need them. Certainly I do. The sample is illustrative of the ample discretion that I enjoy. Note this kind of list in the US is, talk about dilettantism. I mean, completely unimaginable. In the US, if you have a column, it's because you know something about something, right? You write about the economy or whatever. Here, I enjoy, absolute delicious irresponsibility. Every other Tuesday morning, I get up, read the day's papers, and compose my 800-word editorial. I compare writing these pieces to doing origami because they involve making figures out of papers of a fixed size, 800 words. The editorial is a closed poetic form, like a haiku. Again, a difference from most academic writing, which is usually much more open in form. The book that I just published is 600 pages long, so. I email my article to the paper before 3 p.m., and it appears the next morning. There's no back and forth with the editorial office. In the editorial relationship, it is ironically the case that no news from the editor is good news. If they keep you on, they must have their reasons. Basically, it is a Julian affair. I write, I send, and it is published. Instead, instant gratification, instant regret. It is easy to understand the giddiness of the Randolph Hearsts and the Joseph Pulitzers who orchestrate these interventions. I'd like to underscore two aspects of this practice that I believe to be pertinent to the future of anthropology. The first is its deep contrast to ethnography, which, as a form of embodied practice, is completely distinct from writing on the basis of reading other newspapers. Here, I think, is anthropologists' greatest insurance in the future. The lack of embodied experience among editorial writers is often painfully obvious. The eruption of anthropological voices in the public sphere provides a kind of grit, traction, and reality to what I call the coolering of opinion making that could not be more valuable. On the other hand, the timing of opinion writing and the ways in which writerly decisions must be made contrast deeply with the temporal framework of research projects. For my part, I felt that writing in the press frees my academic writing from some of the desiderata for, quote, relevance that I think sometimes weigh unnecessarily on academic anthropology. The relevance of our work is often outside of our work. But in order to key into that, you must be willing to enter the time of politics or the time of opinion or both, and that is a different temporality to the time of research and of writing. The second aspect concerns the implication of these practices for language. Since that's an important subject, I'll pause for some closer commentary. Theory and grounded theory. One of the unintended side effects of all the genre crossing that was going on in the 1980s and 90s was the creation of a caricatural realm known in English as theory with a capital T. What is it exactly that passes for theory? The question is worth asking because not everyone that used to be thought of as a major contributor to anthropological theory would pass the theory with a capital T muster today. I don't know, for instance, whether such key works as Edmund Leach's Political Systems of Highland Burma or Evans Pritchard's Newer Religion would be considered theory by my graduate students. Maybe they would. I'm genuinely not sure. I have to show them this paper. I just wrote it. In part, this is because people tend to recognize theoretical discourse as transpiring in a certain register of abstraction that facilitates the movement of an idea between an open and infinite number of cases. The moment that you need to refer to Gum Sa and Gum Lao or discuss newer ideas of spirit, you're, quote, brought down to ethnographic particulars and have provisionally checked out of the grand game of theory. But this penchant for abstraction has also exposed anthropology to ridicule due to occasional uncertainties regarding the real-world reference that can proliferate in that discourse. One reaction against this esoteric bent of anthropological theory talk has been to embrace a kind of anti-theoretical position. This happened in the discipline of history long before it has in anthropology, and much more powerfully. And history's been much more, let's say, anti-theoretical. And indeed, history's attachment to clear language has been one of the reasons why that discipline flourished while anthropology wavered in the 1990s, for instance. I'm talking about the US here. But taking an anti-theoretical stance is in the end about as sterile as taking an anti-theoretical stance is in the end about as sterile as the quasi-neo-Thomist obsessions of contemporary theorists trying to determine the true meaning of sovereignty, or the exception to the exception, or some such. Here I think that John and Jean Komaroff's formulation of, quote, grounded theory is not bad, though I would suggest an amendment to curb their enthusiasm for so-called theory from the South as today's engine for anthropological innovation. To me, the key source of innovation stems not from the South per se, but rather from anthropological movement between registers, including movement from the angels dancing on the head of a needle discussion of so-called theory to its bizarre instantiations, for instance, in TV screenwriting or in journalism, or theory's subversion from the weight of a single ethnographic exercise. In part, what I'm referring to is the wide, almost wild dissemination of the anthropological sensitivity. There's a vertigo, as well as giddiness and excitement, that comes with the realization of this broadening horizon of what I would characterize as vulnerable anthropologies, an expansion that includes the dissemination of the kind of experimentation that is ethnography, experimentation with embodied knowledge and with writing or communicating the results of this knowledge, and this translation to social worlds that are not containable in university settings, though these vulnerable anthropologies certainly will continue to rely on the existence and flourishing of academic settings, and I think we do need to protect them. I believe that E.P. Thompson's famous work on the British working classes, on the moral economy of the working classes, and the ways in which that moral economy was shaped culturally and politically during times of deep social dislocation, for instance, through the rise of Methodism and other new religious persuasions, may be useful now to think about the future of anthropology and the anthropologies of the future. For as we have seen, dissemination involves transformation, sometimes transformation under cover. Gamio was not simply Boas's mouthpiece. In addition to being genuinely influenced by Boas, Gamio also used Boas's name and figure as useful cover for his own daring interventions. And we've also seen that spaces of dissemination affect the form and content of anthropological work. And they affect these forms not only in the sense that, quote, high concepts need to be translated into bite-sized communicable bits, but also in the sense that new genres and new forms facilitate the development of different kinds of positions and ideas. My newspaper column allows me to say and think things that appear nowhere in my books. I'd like to conclude with a second personal example of how genre choice changes the kind of work that we do. A few years ago, I wrote a play with my brother Alberto, who's a theater director in Mexico City. The play was based on my historical research on intellectuals and power in late 19th century Mexico. I'd been toying with the idea of writing an extended essay on Francisco Bulnes, an intellectual who has fascinated me over the years, who was a traveler, historian, chemist, engineer, newspaper editor, orator, and congressman during the modernizing dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, which is roughly Mexico's equivalent of the post-Meiji restoration era here in Japan. But instead of writing that essay, which I still hope to write one day, I decided to write a play with my brother. That play was successful. It won Mexico's National Drama Award and played for 2 seasons in a Mexico City theater. What was most interesting to me about that experience was that the dramatic form led me to different places than historical narrative would have done. In order to have drama, it turns out, I didn't know this until my brother told me, you need to have characters and dramatic situations that require resolution, denouement. Moreover, dramatic writing relies exclusively on action, and there's almost no room for description in it. This is in marked contrast with historical and ethnographic writing, which I discovered is laden with description. It also contrasts sharply with the duty that historians and anthropologists must discharge, always to contextualize, always to dwell on gray areas, to remark on inconsistencies in character and action, etc. Thus, the result I find is that dramatic writing is in the end more philosophical than historical writing, because in it the author centers squarely on what he or she thinks is the central dramatic conflict, and must then take liberties with the characters in order to bring this conflict out clearly and in an exciting way. As a result, there's a kind of polarization of character in dramatic writing that contrasts with the constant relativization of a character in anthropological writing. This is interesting because there are times when this kind of clarity of position is most welcome. I believe that in my play on intellectuals and power on the cusp of Mexican modernity, I communicated much about what I believe to be essential in that subject, and in ways that were more widely available to a variegated audience. But in order to do that, I had to take some liberties with both characters and events. This is relevant, I think, for thinking about the dissemination of anthropological work, because in the hands of non-professionals, it is this kind of act, this reach for the ethical, political, or dramatic essence of a process that interests people the most, because that kind of clarity is needed for practical orientation. Given the combination of what I've called the expansion of anthropological dilettantism and the combination of a vertiginous expansion of access to anthropological thinking and an equally disruptive trend to making the conditions for creating this knowledge unstable or precarious, forms of writing that are short and on point, like journalism, or long but dramatic, like theater or television writing, becomes significant. My point, in short, is this. Changing structures of employment and vast open systems of dissemination produce conditions of cultural production that have a remote kinship with the movement of my Mexican exiles of the early 20th century, a movement between being well-established, confident, and at home, to being vulnerable, pliable, flexible, and always learning another language. A movement from the confidence of occupying a major position to the tentative and mobile position of the minor. Anthropology's future, in my view, will depend on its willingness to flourish in exile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lomnitz. Because we are running a short of time, I immediately move to the comment by Professor Suzuki Motoi, please. Yeah, please, put there.
Buenas tardes. Es mi gran honor servir como comentarista por el antropólogo tan distinguido, Claudio Lomnitz. Comenzamos. Claudio's paper describes keys to think about the anthropology of future and the future of anthropology. I find two keys are important. The first key is the movement between major and minor register. This is the topic of the first half of the paper. The second key is genre crossing, which is the topic of the second half of the paper. Claudio is crossing the border of Mexico and the United States. He is also crossing the boundary of anthropology, journalism, and playwriting, and he has got new insights on the merit and demerit of ethnographic writing. I enjoyed reading his paper because his experience as a border-crossing anthropologist and genre-crossing anthropologist to some extent resembled my own career. I am a Japanese anthropologist doing research in Mexico and had academic training in the United States. And I work in a museum right now which has more public contact than universities. So first, let me talk about a little bit of myself. As for my movement between major and minor register of anthropology, just like Claudio, anthropology at US universities is my major register. But unlike Claudio, anthropology in Mexico is my major register too. When I went to National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City for the first time, I felt that something sacred was there. And when I met Professor Alfonso Villarrojas, he is an old ethnographer of Maya, Yucatec Mayan people, I felt excited, but at the same time somehow nervous, because I knew I had to speak, but I didn't know what I had to speak. As Claudio describes, as an international student from anthropological minor register, I brought back home what I learned in major registers, and I became Calvaro de Santo. From Mexico, I got the idea of anthropological commitment to national policy, more specifically, the model of indigenista anthropology, that I suppose was carrying the legacy of Gamio's project to promote socioeconomic development among rural poor. From US, I got so-called development anthropology that I learned at the State University of New York at Binghamton in the early 1990s. And in Japan, I tried to form a Japanese version of development anthropology, which tries to watch and improve development assistance policy of Japanese government. Obviously, I'm not so successful as Manuel Gamio because my lack of ability, and partly because there was no such thing as Mexican Revolution in contemporary Japan, the historical moment in which people are excited to construct a new nation. And for my genre crossing, I started my academic career in Chiba University near here. Then 7 years ago, I changed my job. Currently, I work at National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka, Japan. Although the museum is not just a museum, but a research institute, we have museum work anyway. So I have more contact with the public than I was at Chiba University. For example, I am in charge of editing the monthly museum magazine Gekkan Minpaku. Occasionally, I wrote articles by myself, but mostly I edit someone else's article. And also, I'm responsible for conducting a series of movie shows in order to disseminate the idea of social inclusion and autonomy to the public. The theme is one of the core research topics of our museum as a research institute. For example, in this coming August, we are going to show Aquí y Allá. That is a movie of Mexican circular migrants. These experiences of mine at the museum always make me think, what is the relevance of anthropological work for public, and how I can communicate the relevance to the public. Now, I'd like to ask questions about Claudio's paper. I have 3 questions. First, with the movement between major and minor register of anthropology and the resulting practice of Calvaro de Santo be still important in the future of anthropology? In your paper, referring to the crisis of Mexican anthropology in 1980s, you said, quote, and this was also the moment of rupture of old model of the national anthropologist as Calvaro de Santo, end quote. By this, I understand that the Calvaro de Santo practice was over in Mexico. But are you saying that Calvaro de Santo is not valid anymore or still valid in Mexico or elsewhere? And how about the movement between major and minor register? In a sense, I suspect that it is difficult to talk about the tradition of national anthropology anymore, even in so-called major register of anthropology. For example, it is difficult to talk about what is specific about US anthropology. But students from anthropological periphery, like myself 30 years ago, still have to go to United States or Britain or France to receive professional and probably prestigious anthropological training. And many of them come back to their home country, bringing something precious or sacred with them. So what do you think about this continuing practice of Calvaro de Santo and the movement between major and minor? I assume that Calvaro de Santo and the major-minor swinging are valid insofar as the Calvaro de Santo is productive. But the question is how it can be productive. The second question is about genre crossing. Claudio's performance as an editorialist and playwright is impressive. So is his historical and ethnographic work. Does this mean that you are simply suggesting that having extra job beyond the territory of anthropology is rewarding? Or are you suggesting that we have to create a new hybrid type of anthropology by integrating these extra jobs with traditional ethnographic writing? If so, what do you think the new synthesis of anthropology looks like? The third question is about anthropological dilettantism and the precariousness of the reproduction of anthropology. As you mentioned, quite a number of anthropology students do not become professional anthropologists who typically teach anthropology and do research in university settings. This is the case in Mexico, probably in the United States, and definitely in Japan. Given the existence of such students, what should be taught in anthropology class now? Is traditional fieldwork method and ethnography writing so important that students can effectively utilize that skill no matter what kind of occupation they may take? Or should we teach a versatile skill of anthropology as Claudio does, so that students can imagine a new broadened horizon of anthropology? That's all. Thank you very much. Eso es todo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go immediately to Professor Beeman's comment.
Thank you. With your permission, I'll present my comments from here. I'm having a little trouble with my leg. Our thanks to Claudio Lomnitz for an exciting talk that combines both inspiring personal reflections and important observations about the direction for our discipline going forward. I benefited greatly from the major themes of Professor Lomnitz's talk. First, from the observation that borders between nations and cultural spheres matter in terms of shaping knowledge. Second, that the nature of these borders are being transformed through modern technology and communication. And third, that this change is transforming our discipline and our potential for contributing to humanity in exciting ways. When I began my graduate work at the University of Chicago, well, my goodness, almost 5 decades ago, it's shocking, we were largely a white Euro male profession. There were no women at the University of Chicago when I first arrived. The number of anthropologists working outside of the Euro-US Canadian sphere, including Australia, was very small. The exceptions were Japan, India, and Mexico, where strong intellectual traditions were rapidly being developed. Moreover, almost all anthropologists were in academic anthropology departments. The lack of practitioners in our field in other places and in other areas of employment was of little or no concern to my colleagues at the time. The Academy in the 1960s had discovered anthropology, and there was a spurt of growth of jobs in the United States, and a smaller but equivalent burst of jobs in Europe and in these other traditions. As our field grew, more students from outside of the Euro-US Canadian sphere were attracted to American, Canadian, and European universities for graduate training. It seemed that to become a real professionally recognized anthropologist, it was essential to get a degree from a major institution in that sphere. Because jobs were plentiful, many coming from abroad never left the country where they received their PhD, taking up professional life there. Concomitantly, it was difficult for persons with degrees from outside of this circle of university training to get jobs inside the circle. Although I don't like to acknowledge this, there was a dominant intellectual snobbery that was inherent in this pattern. Now, how times have changed. We now have excellent PhD programs all over the world, and students are now coming from the Euro, US, Canadian sphere to study in these programs. The training is theoretically and methodologically sophisticated and completely on a par with the so-called prestige universities of 50 years ago. We are 50% male, 50% female, and we have every gender identity and ethnicity possible in our ranks. The snob factor, accompanied by an annoying, patronizing attitude, has greatly diminished, and thank goodness. We now tend to see our colleagues' work for its quality and not for the institutional label attached to it, and the world of anthropological knowledge is far, far better for it. I was a visiting faculty member at the University of Tokyo 8 years ago at the kind invitation of Professor Yamashita Shinji, who's here today. There were 10 US citizens all studying for their PhD at the University of Tokyo and doing exciting, path-breaking research. I was much impressed. And I am also now visiting at Doshisha University in Kyoto, and there are graduate students from everywhere, including the United States, Canada, and Europe. Other PhD granting Japanese universities have experienced the same phenomenon. Likewise, the great training institutions of Mexico and India have expanded their research and training programs and now graduate some of the best anthropologists in the world. We've seen amazing growth in anthropological doctoral training in China, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, every nation in Latin America, the entire Middle East, including Iran, Israel, Turkey, Lebanon, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Anthropology in North and Sub-Saharan Africa is equally growing, and the list goes on and on. It's a very, very exciting time. For knowledge construction itself, we see a gradual weaning away from exclusive reliance on Western scholarship as a basis for theory and research. We have an international group in linguistic anthropology that was founded by Ide Sachiko, Professor Ide, that is, who I'll have dinner with this evening very happily, they're working to use non-Western languages as the basis for a generation of theoretical insights in language praxis. I also belong to an international consortium of scholars, the Organization for the Promotion of Global Civilization, that's based in China, based in Beijing, developing social science research based on non-Euro-American social models. But I hardly need to tell anyone in this audience in the IUAES about the growth of the international profession. You are all here. What's different is the equalization that we see in respect for each other's training and research. The American columnist Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The Earth is Flat, talking about how technology has equalized societies all over the planet. The Earth is flat for anthropologists as well. Aside from the IUAES, hundreds of international conferences each year provide opportunities for young and established scholars to exchange ideas. The European Sociological Association, European Anthropological Association, the Japanese Anthropological Association, the International Pragmatics Association, the Performance Studies International, and on and on and on. There are hundreds of members from everywhere, and their annual meetings attract worldwide participation, just to name a few of these organizations, and there are many, many more. However, as a US citizen, I should confess something. US politics for the last decade has benefited the world academic community in a very, very strange way. After the undeniable tragedy of September 11th, 2001, with the destruction of the World Trade Towers and attacks on the US Pentagon, the United States became, frankly, paranoid about international visitors. It therefore began a policy of scrutiny regarding the granting of visas that has made international meetings in the United States almost impossible. The US academics continue to complain about this, but the result, and I think a happy result, has been that scholarly meetings outside of the United States have increased tremendously, while they have been reduced inside the United States, with a salutary increase in international participation. But another paradoxically positive consequence of the changing market for academic labor has been the decreasing number of jobs within academia. Many don't see this as a positive development and complain about it a lot, but I am enthusiastic about it. More than 50% of all PhD anthropologists in the United States now work in business, government, industry, and public service. They are still active researchers. They're doing what anthropologists are supposed to do. They're studying human nature through the investigation of human biology, archaeology, culture, and linguistics, but doing this in non-academic settings. They publish their research, they attend international conferences, and they enlighten us about human futures in a technological age. Some of them are here. Many of them are here, actually. Anthropological skills are valued and needed everywhere. This is a growth area for our profession. Again, the snob factor directed against people working outside of the university settings is diminishing, and thank God for that. One consequence of this is to remind us of something important in our own history, the essential need to communicate with the public and to the public about the tremendous contributions we have to make to the understanding of the world. One of our own colleagues, Ashraf Ghani, graduate of Stanford University, was finance minister of Afghanistan, and now he is a candidate for the presidency of that country. We have anthropologists in policy positions everywhere, helping to make the world a better place through greater understanding of the human condition. This was the goal of the late Ruth Benedict and the late Margaret Mead, and many of their generations who worked actively in policy positions as part of their professional work, a goal that was forgotten for a while, but is now alive and active once again, as seen in fact, our other two plenary speakers' addresses in this conference, James Ferguson in particular, dealing with policy. Like Claudio Lomnitz, I also write regularly for the press. I think I have something like 600 editorials in print over the years, and I write plays. So I feel like we're really very compatible. But I envy him his regular weekly column where he can educate the public to do anthropologically informed commentary on hundreds of issues of contemporary interest. Mexican journalism is truly more enlightened than that in the United States. However, I note that my colleague at Stanford this year, where I am visiting, Professor Tanya Luhrmann from Stanford, is now a regular contributing columnist to the New York Times, writing about religion, human psychology, and medical anthropology. There are many others, Helen Fisher, Deborah Tannen, to name two in the United States, and my beloved Japanese mentor who first brought me to Japan, the great Yamaguchi Masao, who just died last year, and who was a public figure as well as a great, great anthropologist. But I am sure you all know many, many others, not only that we do know many others, but we need many more. I urge all of you to listening here to follow Professor Lomnitz's example. Take some of your time. Write 800 words for the public, once or twice a year, maybe even, or if you can, every week. Make it part of your writing habits. I guarantee you that the public will love what you write because they are likely never to have heard this perspective before. So anthropology has emerged from its narrow intellectual confines of a half-century ago to become a worldwide phenomenon. Professor Lomnitz correctly states that our future as anthropologists depends on our ability to flourish in exile. I would say we are already flourishing in exile from our countries of birth, in exile from our institutions of training, and I thoroughly hope that we are living in exile from our normal modes of communicating. But our exile is a happy one. Because we are becoming world citizens, we are helping to draw the world together and to foster international understanding through our holistic message, underscoring our basic humanity. So my toast today is to exile. May it be a happy and productive one for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the Claudio's talk was extremely entertaining, deeply provocative, and seriously insightful. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time because we need to celebrate. Well, we're not going to have a banquet at 7:30, and the place is about 10 minutes away from here. So we will have to stop shortly. But already the two discussants asked a lot of questions, and perhaps it's very difficult to answer all of them, but just very tersely, briefly, I'd like to have your final words.
Well, simply to thank you. I know that we can continue talking around the banquet, and there really is a lot to say, especially about for example, the future of the Caballo de Santo. We hope so. It's such a beautiful image that I hope that the saints ride again, but I don't know where they're going to come from. That's the question. They're not necessarily going to come from those same old places. I was happy to hear about Alfonso Villarrojas, because he was actually the person who published my first book that Junji Koizumi commented on. So that there's also personal stories there. But yeah, simply thank you very much, and I think that I hope that we can continue the conversation over food. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Once again, please give him a big applause. Thank you very much.